I'm 64 years old, and for the past 23 nights, lights have appeared on the water a quarter-mile from my house. Not boat lights, not bioluminescence. Something else, moving in patterns that repeat every 17 minutes. My son called 6 days ago from Virginia, describing a dream he's had 4 nights running, drowning in warm water, while a woman's voice sings in a language he doesn't know. Yesterday, my daughter called from Oregon. Same dream, same voice, same overwhelming sensation that something is calling them home. They're both driving here now, and I haven't slept more than 2 hours in a week because I know what the lights are, I know who's singing, and I know that after 30 years of silence, the ocean has decided it's time to return what I gave back. Hurricane Claudia made landfall on September 14, 1993, as a Category 4 storm. I was 34 years old, living alone in a house my grandfather built on a stretch of North Carolina coast, remote enough that evacuation orders sometimes didn't reach us until the storm was already visible on the horizon. I didn't evacuate. I'd ridden out hurricanes before, and Claudia's projected path had her weakening before she reached us. The projection was wrong. The storm surge reached 14 feet. The wind stripped shingles from my roof and shattered both windows on the eastern wall. I spent 6 hours in my bathtub with a mattress pulled over me, listening to my house try to come apart. When the wind finally dropped enough that I could stand without being knocked down, I went outside to see what was left. The boat shed was gone. Not damaged, gone, reduced to scattered planks spread across 100 yards of beach. My neighbor's dock had been torn loose and deposited in my yard. A refrigerator sat upright in the dunes, doors still closed, and in the wreckage where my shed had stood, something was moving. I thought it was a seal at first. The shape was wrong, but I was exhausted, and in the gray light just after dawn, with debris everywhere, I wasn't processing details clearly. I moved closer. It was tangled in fishing net, barely moving, and as I approached it made a sound, not a bark, not anything I recognized, but something high and thin that made my chest hurt to hear it. I got within 10 feet before I understood what I was looking at. The upper body was an infant, perhaps 6 months old in human terms, with a round face, gray eyes that tracked my movement with obvious intelligence, and small hands that clutched at the net wrapped around it. Below the waist, the body transitioned, not abruptly, but gradually, the skin becoming something else, developing a faint scale pattern, the color shifting from pale human flesh to something darker, greenish-gray, and where legs should have been, there was a tail. Not decorative, not symbolic. A functioning tail with a horizontal fluke, battered and bleeding along one edge, moving weakly against the sand. It watched me. That's what I remember most clearly from those first minutes. It didn't thrash or try to escape. It watched me with an expression I recognized because I'd seen it on injured animals before, a kind of resigned awareness that its survival now depended on what I chose to do. I should have called someone. The Coast Guard was already running rescue operations up and down the coast. There were marine biologists at 3 different universities within 2 hours' drive. I had a radio in my truck that still worked, but I didn't reach for it. Instead, I knelt in the wet sand, pulled my knife from my belt, and started cutting away the net. The net had been around it long enough to cut into the skin in places. The tail was injured, a deep gash along the fluke's leading edge that was bleeding into the sand. The small hands had abrasions across the palms, and when I freed them, they immediately reached toward me, then stopped, hesitant, uncertain. I finished cutting the last of the net away and sat back, my hands shaking. It made the sound again, quieter this time, and with a different quality, not distress, something else. The gray eyes stayed locked on my face. I was raised coastal. I knew the stories. Every fishing community has them, passed down through generations. Mermaids, selkies, sea people, things seen at distance, shapes in the water that might have been seals or might have been something else. My grandfather swore he'd seen something once, 40 miles offshore in deep water, that surfaced beside his boat and looked at him with a woman's face before it dove. He never told that story in town, only to family late at night when the wind was right. I'd always thought it was the whiskey talking. The thing in front of me was real. It was injured. It was an infant. And every minute I sat there was a minute I should have been using to call for help. The kind of help that would mean government officials, marine biologists, photographers, papers to sign, custody transferred to people with credentials and facilities, and no reason to treat this creature as anything but a specimen. I made my decision in less than 30 seconds. My largest stock tank was a 1,000-gallon industrial unit I'd bought years earlier for a rainwater collection project I'd never finished. It was behind my house, empty, with a filtration pump I'd never installed. I'd need seawater. I'd need a way to keep the water temperature stable. I'd need food, though I had no idea what it ate. I'd need to do all of this without anyone noticing, which meant working alone, which meant moving fast before someone came by to check on storm damage. I pulled off my jacket and wrapped it around the small body. It didn't fight. The tail moved once, a weak attempt at propulsion, but the injury made the movement ineffective. Up close, I could see the gills, 3 slits on each side of the neck, opening and closing with visible effort in the open air. I had no idea how long it could survive out of water. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, dense in the way marine mammals are dense, but still light enough that I could carry it without strain. It made no sound as I carried it toward my house. The gray eyes stayed open, watching everything, the sky, the scattered debris, the ocean retreating as I climbed the dune. When I glanced down, I found it watching my face again, and I had the unsettling sense that it was memorizing me. I had a ceramic sink in my mudroom that I'd never bothered to hook up to plumbing. I filled it from the kitchen tap, added every container of sea salt I had in my pantry, and lowered the infant into the water. The change was immediate. The gills flared open. The tail began moving with more strength. The small hands pushed against the basin's sides, and the gray eyes closed for several seconds. Relief, or exhaustion, or both. It was 9:30 in the morning. The storm had passed. My nearest neighbor was half a mile down the beach, and I knew he'd evacuated. I had perhaps 6 hours before anyone might come by to check on me, and in those 6 hours, I needed to turn a stock tank into a viable habitat for something that shouldn't exist. I filled the tank with 30 trips to the ocean, hauling 5-gallon buckets up the dune path, while the infant waited in the mudroom sink. I installed the filtration pump with brackets I had to improvise from shelf supports. I tested the water temperature and realized I'd need a heating element, which meant a trip to town, which meant leaving it alone. I checked on it every 15 minutes. It stayed quiet, moving in slow circles within the basin's limited space, occasionally surfacing to examine the air above the waterline. By 4 in the afternoon, the tank was as ready as I could make it. I carried the basin outside and lowered it to the tank's edge. The infant surfaced, looked at the larger body of water, then at me. I tipped the basin. It slid into the tank and immediately dove, the tail propelling it down to the bottom in one smooth motion. I watched it explore the space. The tank was 8 feet across and 4 feet deep, enormous compared to the basin, but I could already see it was temporary. This creature was going to grow. It surfaced in the center of the tank, and for the first time, I heard it make a sound that wasn't distress. A clicking, almost mechanical, like sonar. It was trying to map the space. I had no idea if it would work in a tank this small, but the sound continued for nearly a minute before stopping. Then the gray eyes found me again, and we looked at each other across the water. I'd committed myself to something I didn't understand and couldn't explain. I'd chosen secrecy over science, impulse over reason. I had no plan beyond the next 24 hours. And as I stood there in the fading afternoon light, watching something impossible circle in a stock tank behind my house, I understood with absolute certainty that my life had just divided into before and after, and I would never be able to explain the difference to anyone. The first week nearly killed both of us. The heating element I installed pulled more amperage than my breaker box could handle and tripped the power to my entire house twice before I rigged a separate line. The filtration pump clogged on the third day with sediment I hadn't anticipated, and the water turned cloudy within hours. I had to drain half the tank, haul fresh seawater, and recalibrate the salinity using a hydrometer I bought from a marine supply shop 40 miles away, inventing a story about planning to keep a saltwater aquarium that the clerk clearly didn't believe. The infant didn't eat for the first 4 days. I tried raw fish, cooked fish, clams, squid, seaweed. Everything sank to the bottom untouched. On the 5th day, I bought live minnows from a bait shop and dumped 2 dozen into the tank. They scattered. The infant tracked them for perhaps 30 seconds, then moved, faster than I'd seen it move before, and caught one in its hands. Not its mouth, its hands. It held the fish up, examined it, then bit into it, with teeth I hadn't seen clearly until that moment, small, sharp, designed for tearing. It ate 7 minnows in 10 minutes, and I watched every second, trying to understand what I was feeding. By the second week, patterns emerged. It was nocturnal, or at least most active after dark. The clicking sounds increased at night, and I realized it was using echolocation constantly, mapping the tank, the yard, possibly the shoreline beyond. During the day, it stayed near the bottom, occasionally surfacing to float on its back and watch the sky through the mesh cover I'd installed to keep birds away. It tolerated my presence, but didn't approach me. When I cleaned the tank or adjusted equipment, it retreated to the far side and watched until I finished. The logistics were harder than the care. I was hauling 60 gallons of seawater every 3 days to keep the tank properly cycled. The heating element ran constantly, and my electric bill jumped by $200 the first month. I bought fish in quantities large enough that the grocery clerk started commenting on it. I told her I was feeding a large dog. The lie felt thin, but she accepted it. No one came to visit. That was coastal isolation working in my favor. After a hurricane, people expected repairs to take weeks, expected neighbors to be busy with their own damage, expected anyone living this far from town to be self-sufficient by necessity. My nearest neighbor returned 2 weeks after the storm and waved from his porch when he saw me. I waved back. We didn't walk over to check on each other because that wasn't how we lived out here. Privacy was currency, and we'd all paid for ours by choosing houses where the nearest voice was a half-mile away. But I couldn't hide the tank forever. It was 8 feet across, 4 feet tall, visible from certain angles, even behind my house. I bought tarps and built a frame, told myself I was protecting the water from debris and sun exposure, but I knew what I was really doing. I was hiding evidence of something I couldn't explain and didn't want to share. The infant grew faster than I'd anticipated. By the end of the first month, it had gained visible length and mass. The tail was longer, the flukes broader. The gash from the net had healed into a pale scar. The body was changing proportions, the torso lengthening, the arms developing muscle definition. It looked less like a human infant and more like something built for a different medium, and I started to understand that whatever developmental timeline I'd assumed based on human growth was probably wrong. It started mimicking sounds in the second month. I heard my own voice first, a fragment of speech I'd said while working near the tank, played back hours later in something close to my cadence but not quite my tone. Then birdsong, accurate enough that I looked up expecting to see the bird before I realized the sound was coming from the tank. Then the creak of my porch steps, the slam of my truck door, the specific click of my kitchen light switch. It was cataloging its environment through sound, and I didn't know if that was communication, experimentation, or something else entirely. I started talking to it, not because I thought it understood language, but because the silence was making me strange. I narrated my tasks, cleaning the filter, adjusting. The temperature, counting fish before feeding. I described the weather. I told it about the coast, about storms, about the ocean beyond the tank. It listened. I know it listened because the mimicry became more frequent, and some of the sounds it returned were clear attempts at words. Not successful attempts, but deliberate. The mouth structure wasn't built for human speech, but it was trying. By the third month, I'd developed a routine that felt sustainable. Morning feedings before dawn, when no one would see me carrying buckets to the tank. Afternoon maintenance while my neighbors were inside during the hottest part of the day. Evening sessions where I sat near the tank and talked, and it surfaced to watch me, and we existed in a space that felt less like captivity and more like cohabitation. But sustainable didn't mean safe. I'd told no one. My family, 2 siblings living in other states, called occasionally, but accepted my vague answers about repairs and recovery. I'd stopped going to town except when necessary. I'd canceled a dentist appointment, a mammogram, a dinner with the one friend I saw more than twice a year. I was isolating myself to protect a secret that grew heavier every day. I started keeping a journal in December. I told myself it was documentation, scientific record-keeping, something that might matter if I ever had to explain what I'd done. But the entries read more like confessions. I described the sounds it made, the way it watched me, the intelligence visible in every interaction. I described my fear of discovery and my growing certainty that discovery was inevitable, because the creature in my tank was outgrowing the space faster than I could adapt. On New Year's Eve, I sat beside the tank at midnight and watched it surface. It had been 3.5 months since I'd found it in the wreckage of my boat shed. It was perhaps 3 feet long now, crowned to tail tip, with a body that moved through water with a grace that made my chest ache to watch. The gray eyes tracked me as they always did, and for the first time, I let myself think the thought I'd been avoiding since September. I was raising a daughter, not a specimen, not a rescued animal. A daughter who would never be mine, who belonged to a world I couldn't enter, who I was keeping in a tank behind my house because I had no idea what else to do, and couldn't stand the thought of letting her go. The last time I saw her clearly, she was 30 years younger and 7 feet long, and I was standing knee-deep in ocean water at 3 in the morning, watching her swim toward the drop-off where the continental shelf falls away into darkness. She surfaced once, 50 yards out, and I thought I saw her turn back toward shore, toward me. But the moon was down, and I might have imagined it. Then she dove, and I stood in the water until dawn, and she didn't surface again. My children are here now. They arrived yesterday, and tonight we'll walk down to the beach together because the lights are back and the dreams won't stop. I don't know what we'll find. I don't know if she's been out there all 30 years, or if she's traveled distances I can't imagine, and only recently returned. I don't know if she remembers me, if memory works the same for her, if the bond I felt was mutual, or just my own need projected onto a creature who had no choice but to accept my care. But I know she's calling us, all of us, me, the children I raised while grieving the one I released, their children who carry her story without knowing it. And tomorrow at dawn, we'll stand on the beach and wait to see what the ocean sends back after 3 decades of silence. I'm 64 years old, and I kept a secret that changed everything. This is what happened. By the 3rd year, I understood she was trying to speak. Not with words. She had no vocal cords built for air. But she'd learned to mimic the rhythms of my voice when I spoke to her, producing clicks and whistles that rose and fell with the same patterns. When I said her name, I'd started calling her Marina, though I knew it was absurd. She'd tilt her head and make a sound that had 3 syllables. The cadence matched. She watched my face constantly. If I smiled, something shifted in her expression that might have been a smile back, though her features didn't move the same way. If I cried, she'd press her hands against the tank glass and make a low sound in her throat that I felt in my chest, more than heard. The hands were the most human thing about her, 4 fingers and an opposable thumb webbed to the first knuckle. She used them constantly. By age 2, she'd figured out how to unlatch the tank cover if I didn't secure it properly. By 3, she was manipulating objects with clear intent, stacking the shells I gave her, arranging the rocks on the tank floor in patterns I couldn't decipher. I brought her books, waterproof children's books at first, then laminated photographs. She studied them for hours, tracing her finger across the images. Pictures of the ocean fascinated her. Pictures of people made her agitated. She'd press her whole body against the glass when I showed her photos of fish, as if trying to reach through to them. The mimicry expanded. She began to reproduce sounds from outside. The creak of my back door, the cry of the gulls, the diesel rumble of fishing boats in the harbor a mile away. She did it in sequence sometimes, like she was telling me what her day had sounded like. I started keeping a log of the sounds she made and what I thought triggered them. I found research on dolphin communication at the library. Margaret Howe Lovat's name came up, the woman who'd lived with a dolphin in the 1960s, who'd tried to teach it English. The experiment had been controversial, ultimately abandoned, and Lovat herself had been dismissed by the scientific community. But her logs showed the same thing I was seeing, an intelligence trying to bridge an impossible gap. Marina learned to signal her needs. A specific sharp whistle meant she was hungry. A low vibration meant the water temperature was wrong. A rapid clicking pattern meant she wanted me to stay nearby, not to leave yet. I learned her language faster than she learned mine because hers was more consistent. By age 4, she recognized individual words. I tested it systematically, the way the dolphin researchers had. If I said food, without showing it, she'd move to the feeding corner of the tank. If I said night, she'd settle to the bottom and tuck her tail beneath her. She knew at least 30 words by my count, possibly more. But the comprehension went deeper than vocabulary. She understood emotion. When I came to her upset, after the call telling me my mother had died, after the confrontation with my ex-husband over visitation rights, she knew before I spoke. She'd go still in the water and watch me with an intensity that felt like being seen through. Then she'd sing. That's the only word for it. Not the whistles and clicks of her usual communication, but something more complex. Notes held and modulated, layered over each other in ways I didn't think were physically possible. The sound filled the shed, resonated in the metal tank, vibrated in my sternum. It didn't fix anything, but it acknowledged it. I was being comforted by something that wasn't human in a language that didn't exist on land. I started singing to her. Old songs my grandmother had taught me, simple melodies that had no words or whose words I'd forgotten. She learned them. She'd repeat them back note perfect, then add elaborations I never could have produced. We'd sing together, my voice in air and hers in water, and I understood that this was conversation, not about food or temperature or schedules, but something more fundamental. She began to teach me her sounds. She'd make a whistle-click combination and point, her hand emerging from the water, at something specific, the moon through the shed window, the bucket I used for water changes, a fish I'd brought her. She wanted me to associate the sound with the object. I tried to reproduce her sounds. Most I couldn't. My throat wasn't built for it. But some I managed, and when I did, her whole body would move in what I learned to recognize as excitement. By age 5, we had perhaps 100 shared signals. Not enough for complex ideas, but enough for dailiness, enough to share something that looked from the outside like relationship. But there were gaps I couldn't bridge. She'd make sounds I knew were important, long, elaborate patterns that repeated with slight variations, and I had no idea what they meant. She'd watch me with clear expectation, waiting for a response I didn't know how to give. I'd disappoint her. I could see it in the way she'd sink to the tank floor and turn away. I found a researcher's journal article about orca vocalizations. Each pod has distinct dialects, learned and passed down. Orcas, separated from their pods, can survive physically, but lose the ability to communicate with their own kind. They're alive, but linguistically alone. I wondered what dialect Marina had been born into, what sounds her mother would have taught her if the hurricane hadn't torn them apart, what I was failing to give her because I was the wrong species, using the wrong tongue. She started producing sounds at frequencies I couldn't hear but could feel. The water in the tank would vibrate. Objects on the shelves would rattle. My dog would whine and pace outside the shed until the sounds stopped. I bought a low-frequency microphone used for recording whale songs and captured some of it. The waveforms on the computer screen looked like speech, patterned, structured, deliberate. I played them back to her. She responded immediately, producing more sounds in the same range. We were having a conversation I could record but not participate in. She was speaking in a register built for ocean depths and vast distances, and I was bound to the narrow frequencies of air and human hearing. By age 6, she'd grown cautious about what she showed me. If I brought someone near the shed, the repairman who fixed the water heater, my daughter visiting for a weekend, Marina would go silent and still. She'd sink to the bottom and stay there until I came alone. She understood secrecy. She understood that she needed to hide. That awareness broke something in me. She wasn't just an intelligent animal adapting to captivity. She understood her own otherness. She knew she was a secret, a danger, an impossibility that needed to be concealed. And she was learning to conceal herself because I'd taught her that survival required it. She was 8 years old when the sound started that I couldn't stop. I'd wake at 3 in the morning to a vibration in the floorboards, a pressure in my inner ear that made my teeth ache. It wasn't loud. It was below loud, beneath the range where sound becomes something you hear instead of feel. My dogs would bark themselves hoarse at nothing. My neighbors, quarter-mile away, complained their windows rattled at night. They blamed the quarry 5 miles inland, blasting rock for the highway expansion. I knew better. Marina had outgrown the tank in every measurable way, 7 feet from the crown of her head to the tip of her tail, shoulders broad enough that she had to turn sideways to move through the space between the tank wall and the filtration system. When she surfaced, she still breathed air, needed it every 20 minutes. Her head nearly touched the shed ceiling. The tank that had seemed vast when I installed it now held her the way a bathtub holds an adult. She couldn't extend fully. She moved in tight circles, the same path worn into her muscles from repetition. I built an addition to the shed, doubled the water volume, improved the filtration, installed a chiller system that cost more than my truck. It gave her more room. For 6 months, it was enough. Then she kept growing. The sounds intensified. Low-frequency calls that traveled through water, through rock, through the coastal shelf. I recorded them and compared them to humpback whale songs. The structure was similar, repeated phrases, themes that varied slightly each time. She was singing, but not for me. Marine life responded. Harbor seals hauled out on the rocks below my property, in numbers I'd never seen, all of them oriented toward the shed. Dolphins appeared in the channel, stayed for days, and left. A juvenile gray whale spent 2 weeks in the shallow water off my beach in late summer, logging at the surface, and I knew it was wrong. Gray whales don't stop there. They migrate straight through. She was calling to them, or they were responding to her. Either way, I was losing the ability to keep her hidden. The state marine biologist showed up in October asking about unusual animal activity. I lied to his face, said I hadn't noticed anything different. He walked the property, stood 50 yards from the shed with its industrial hum and saltwater runoff, and I watched him choose not to look closer. People don't investigate what they don't want to find. But the animals kept coming. Marina stopped eating regularly. I'd bring her squid, mackerel, the live crab she'd always loved, and she'd ignore them. She'd lost weight. I could see the definition of her ribs beneath the gray skin, the hollows above her collarbones. When I put my hand in the water, she didn't swim to me the way she used to. She'd press herself against the far wall of the tank and make sounds I'd never heard from her, high, sharp whistles that made my ears ring, distress calls. I knew them from the marine mammal research I'd read years ago, the sounds captive dolphins made when they were dying. I consulted a veterinarian 3 hours away, someone who worked with aquarium marine mammals. I told her I was doing research on seal rehabilitation. She explained the signs of depression in captive marine animals: refusal to eat, repetitive behaviors, self-harm. They stop wanting to live, she said, especially the intelligent ones. They understand they're contained, and some of them choose not to continue. I drove home and sat in the shed for 6 hours, watching Marina move in her tight circles, and I understood that I was killing her by keeping her alive. She was 9 years old when she broke the tank. Not deliberately. She'd been making the low-frequency calls, her body pressed against the reinforced wall, and the vibration cracked the seal. Water began to leak, slowly at first, then faster. I had maybe an hour before the tank would drain to a level she couldn't survive in. I could have called someone, a welder, an emergency repair service. I could have moved her to the stock tank I'd kept for emergencies, the one that would hold her for a day or two while I fixed the brake. Instead, I backed my truck to the shed door and started filling the bed with salt water from the hose I'd rigged to the ocean intake. It took 30 minutes to fill it enough. Marina watched from the failing tank, her gray eyes tracking every movement. She knew. I could see it in the way she held herself still, the way her breathing slowed. I climbed into the tank. The water was chest-deep on me, barely deep enough to cover her. I got my arms under her shoulders and tail and lifted. She was impossibly heavy. Dense muscle and cartilage, built for water, not air. I barely made it to the truck bed. I lowered her into the water I'd filled it with, and she sank immediately, disoriented by the shallowness. I drove to the beach at 20 miles per hour, water sloshing over the sides, Marina's tail hanging over the tailgate. It was 3 in the morning, no moon. The only light was my headlamps and the bioluminescence in the water where the waves broke on shore. I backed the truck as close to the waterline as I could without getting stuck. The tide was high, waves reaching within 10 feet of my bumper. Marina lay still in the truck bed. Her breathing was rapid, shallow, stressed. I'd read that marine mammals could die from the shock of being moved, from the change in pressure and temperature and environment. I climbed in beside her and put my hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," I said. "I should have done this years ago." She turned her head, looked at me with those eyes that had watched me for 9 years, that knew me better than anyone living. Then she made a sound I'd never heard from her, soft, almost a sigh. Her hand came up and touched my face, webbed fingers gentle on my cheek. I waited until the wave pattern gave me a bigger set. When the water rushed up to the truck, I lifted her again, my back screaming, my arms shaking, and carried her into the surf. The water took her weight. She hung in my arms for 3 seconds, disoriented, adjusting. Then her tail moved. One strong sweep and she was 10 feet away from me. She surfaced, looked back. I was crying, seawater and tears and the grief of knowing I'd done the right thing too late. "Go," I said. "You were never mine." She dove. I saw the pale flash of her belly as she turned, the powerful sweep of her tail. Then darkness, just the sound of the waves and my own breathing, and the vast empty ocean that had taken back what I should never have kept. It took me 2 years to accept what I already knew. She was dying in that tank. Not quickly, nothing about her happened quickly, but steadily, methodically, the way a tree dies when its roots can't spread. She'd stopped growing at 6 feet, crown to tail tip. Her skin had lost the iridescent quality it held in the first years, dulled to something closer to ash than pearl. The songs she'd produced so freely as a child came less often, and when they did, they sounded wrong, flat, a mimicry of what they'd been. By 1998, she refused food more often than she accepted it. I'd bring live fish, crabs, Still moving, squid I'd driven 2 hours to buy from commercial fishermen who didn't ask questions. She'd watch them swim in circles, then turn away. Her eyes, still that impossible gray, tracked me with what I can only describe as accusation. The sound started in March of 1999, low frequency, deep enough that I felt them in my chest before I heard them. They came at night, vibrating through the rock foundation of my property, through the water table itself. Dogs 3 properties down began howling at 2 a.m. with perfect regularity. Marine life appeared in concentrations I'd never seen. Harbor seals clustered in the cove below my house, gray whales deviating from their migration path to circle offshore. She was calling, not to me, to something I couldn't give her. I found her one morning with her forehead pressed against the tank wall, her breathing shallow, her tail barely moving. I'd seen that posture before, years ago, in a sea lion at the Marine Rehabilitation Center where I'd volunteered before all this began. We'd called it the shutdown, the point where a creature stops fighting captivity and starts the process of dying instead. I made the decision that night. Not quickly. I sat with it for 6 hours until dawn, watching her motionless form in the tank. But once made, it was absolute. The logistics were brutal. She weighed approximately 300 pounds. The nearest accessible deep water was half a mile down a rocky beach trail that hadn't been maintained in a decade. I couldn't involve anyone else, couldn't rent equipment that would leave records, couldn't explain what I was transporting or why. I bought a commercial fishing gurney designed for moving large tuna, paid cash at a marine supply store 2 counties away, reinforced it with additional strapping, spent a week scouting the trail at night, clearing obstacles, identifying the route with the most gradual grade. I chose June 15th, 1999, new moon, low tide at 2 a.m. Weather forecast clear, no wind. I'd studied the bathymetry charts until I had them memorized. The continental shelf dropped to profound depths less than a mile from that beach, a submarine canyon cutting close to shore where deep water species sometimes appeared in fishermen's nets. I told my children I'd be doing equipment maintenance overnight. They were 12 and 14 then, old enough to be left, young enough not to question. I put them to bed at 9, waited until their breathing steadied into sleep, then went to the tank. She knew. Before I touched the equipment, before I began draining water into transport containers, she surfaced and looked directly at me. Her expression, I won't call it human, but it held recognition, understanding, and something that looked unbearably like grief. The transfer took 40 minutes. I'd practiced the movements with dead weight, timed every step. Lifting her from the tank, securing her on the gurney, covering her with wet towels soaked in seawater, strapping the portable pump that would keep water flowing over her gills. She didn't fight. She went completely still, her body trusting my hands in a way that made my chest physically ache. The journey down that trail remains the longest half-mile of my life. The gurney wheels caught on roots, on stones. Twice I had to stop and reposition, my shoulders screaming, my hands shaking. I talked to her the entire time, narrating what I was doing, where we were going, the same voice I'd used when she was small enough to hold in my arms. I don't know if she understood words, but she responded to tone. Her breathing stayed steady. We reached the beach at 2:47 a.m. The tide was out, exposing a stretch of sand that sloped gradually into black water. I pulled the gurney to the waterline, then past it until waves began washing over her tail. Her eyes opened. Her gills flared. I unfastened the straps. She didn't leave immediately. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, she remained motionless, except for her gills working, processing salt water that wasn't confined to a tank. Then she lifted her upper body, using her arms to lever herself forward, her tail beginning to move with the kind of power I'd never seen in the tank's limited space. She turned back once, looked at me with those gray eyes. I raised my hand, not waving, just acknowledgement, witness. Then she dove. The displacement of water knocked me backward 3 steps. I stood in the shallows, chest deep, watching the place. Where she'd disappeared, waiting for her to surface. She didn't. The water went still. The moon was dark. The ocean looked like black glass. I waited on that beach until dawn. She never resurfaced. When light began touching the horizon, I pulled the gurney back up the trail, cleaned it, burned the towels, eliminated every trace of the transport. My children found me at breakfast acting as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I'd raised her for 6 years, watched her grow from something barely alive into something powerful, intelligent, wholly herself. And I'd let her go, not because I wanted to, but because keeping her would have killed her. Love, I learned that night, sometimes looks like opening your hands even when everything in you wants to hold on. The tank stayed in place for another 3 years. I couldn't bring myself to dismantle it. I kept it full, kept it clean, kept it maintained, just in case. In case she came back injured, in case she needed refuge, in case I'd been wrong. She never returned to it. The water went still, stayed still. Eventually I drained it, sold the equipment, let the space grow over with coastal scrub. But I never stopped watching the ocean. Every dawn, every dusk, scanning the water for something that breached different than a seal, that moved with a purpose marine mammals don't possess. 30 years is a long time to watch for something that never surfaces. Long enough that the watching becomes part of your identity. Long enough that you forget what it felt like before the waiting began. I turned 34 the summer I released her. When the lights appeared offshore in 2029, I was 64. That span contains most of an adult life. Marriages among my friends ended and began. Children were born, raised, left home. The coastal highway was widened. High-speed internet reached our community. The fishing industry collapsed and partially recovered. People died. The world kept moving. I stayed in the same house, kept the same routines. My children grew up with a mother who walked the beach every morning before dawn and every evening after dusk, whose eyes always tracked toward the water during conversations, who kept a section of shelving filled with marine biology texts and navigation charts despite having no boat and no stated research purpose. They asked twice. Once, when my daughter was 16, helping me sort through storage. "Why did you have that huge tank?" I told her I'd been rehabilitating a seal. The lie came easily by then. Once, when my son was 23, standing with me on the beach at sunset, "What are you always looking for out there?" I told him old habits from my research days. He nodded, didn't press. Children learn early which questions parents will answer and which doors stay closed. I dated briefly in my 40s. A man from the community, widowed, kind, patient. It lasted 8 months. He ended it gently, saying I seemed to be waiting for something, and until I stopped waiting, there wasn't room for anyone else. He was right. I didn't try again. My daughter gave me 2 grandchildren. My son moved inland for work, married, divorced, returned. They built their lives in the normal way lives are built, through work and relationships and accumulated years. I built mine through watching, through the systematic scanning of shoreline and surf that became as automatic as breathing. The ocean gave me nothing, no signs, no surfaces that looked wrong, no gray eyes watching from the kelp beds. For 30 years, the water remained exactly what it appeared to be. Salt, current, predictable marine life following predictable patterns. Marine biologists documented the return patterns I'd read about in those first desperate months. Sea turtles navigating thousands of miles to natal beaches, salmon returning to spawn in the precise creek of their birth, whales maintaining multi-generational knowledge of feeding grounds. The research proved long-term memory, site fidelity, inherited behavior. It proved return was possible. It didn't prove she would. I watched my body age in the way coastal bodies do, skin weathered by salt air, joints stiffening from cold water and damp, hands growing rough. I watched the town change around me. Tourist traffic increased in summer. 2 hotels were built. The marine sanctuary was expanded. Kayak rental businesses opened and closed. The old fishing families sold property to tech workers who could teleport their jobs. I stayed. The house was paid off. I had work that required no explanation, freelance medical transcription, done from home, flexible hours. My real work was the watching. Support groups exist for families of the missing. I looked into them once. The literature described ambiguous loss, grief without closure, without a body, without certainty of death. Parents of vanished children who couldn't move forward because they couldn't confirm the ending. Families of sailors lost at sea who watched horizons for decades. The psychology was clear. Unresolved disappearance freezes people at the moment of separation. I understood the mechanism. It didn't help. How do you find closure for something the world doesn't believe existed? How do you grieve when you're the one who chose the separation? I kept no photographs. That would have been impossible to explain. But I kept measurements, detailed observations written in private journals, stored in a fireproof safe. Dates, growth rates, behavioral changes, the precise location of her release, evidence of nothing provable, everything undeniable. My grandchildren grew old enough to notice their grandmother's strangeness. "Why does Grandma always look at the ocean?" my grandson asked his mother when he was 5. My daughter's answer, overheard, "She used to be a scientist. She studied the water." Another lie, layered onto the foundation lie, building a structure of false explanation that let everyone avoid the truth. The truth was simpler and more impossible. I was waiting for my daughter to come home, not the human children I'd raised with normal love and normal loss. The other one. The one I'd held as she died and then brought back, the one I'd fed for 6 years, spoken to in the dark, released into water I couldn't follow her into. That daughter, the one who'd never stopped being mine just because she wasn't human, ambiguous loss. The term felt clinical, insufficient. I wasn't ambiguous about anything. I knew she'd survived. She'd been healthy at release, strong, ready. I knew the ocean held her. I knew she'd gone to the depths she was meant for. What I didn't know was whether she remembered, whether the years in my care had marked her the way they'd marked me, whether an aquatic creature capable of human expressions could carry something like memory or recognition or bond across decades in an environment I could never access. The marine biology was encouraging. Orcas maintain lifelong family structures. Dolphins recognize individuals after 20 years of separation. Elephants mourn their dead across generations. Intelligence correlates with memory, and she'd been intelligent, devastatingly intelligent, even at 6 years old. But the biology also noted critical periods, windows in development when bonds form or don't. She'd spent her first 6 years with me, her formative period, but then 30 years in an environment that should have overwritten those early months with the patterns of her actual species, her actual life. I had no evidence she'd remember, no reason to expect return beyond the desperate mathematics of hope. So I watched, through my 40s and 50s and into my 60s, through clear days and storms, through the slow accumulation of days that becomes years, that becomes decades. My children checked on me with increasing frequency as I aged, worried in the way adult children worry about parents who seem stuck. I wasn't stuck. I was faithful. There's a difference. The house maintenance fell behind. Paint faded. The deck boards needed replacing. I did what was necessary to prevent collapse, nothing more. My energy went to the watching, to the dawn walks and evening scans and the nighttime hours, standing at the window that faced the water, looking for movement that didn't match wave patterns or kelp beds or the predictable behavior of seals. In 2028, I turned 63. My daughter staged what she called an intervention, suggesting I sell the house, move inland closer to her family, except that the research phase of my life was over. I thanked her and declined. She left frustrated. I understood. From the outside, I looked like a woman unable to let go of the past. From the inside, I was a mother maintaining the only vigil that mattered. 30 years. A generation. Long enough that no one who'd known me in 1999 would recognize the woman I'd become. Long enough that the watching had worn grooves into my daily existence as deep as the grooves water wears, in stone. The ocean remained silent. The vigil continued. I aged. The waves broke. The tides cycled. The seasons turned. And every morning I walked to the water's edge and looked for something that never appeared. Until it did. The light started on October 12th, 2029, 3 weeks after her 64th birthday. I was bringing in groceries when I saw the first one, a pale glow in the water, maybe a quarter-mile offshore, just visible past the rock shelf where the shelf drops away. I stood there with 2 bags in my hands and watched it pulse. Once, twice. Then nothing. I told myself it was a boat, told myself it was bioluminescence. We get dinoflagellates sometimes after warm spells, whole patches of water that glow blue-green when disturbed. I'd seen it dozens of times. This wasn't that. The second night, the light appeared in the same location, same depth, same slow pulse. 3 beats, then dark. I timed it. 9:17 p.m. I sat on the back steps with the porch light off and watched until it faded at 11:40. By the 4th night, there were 2 lights. By the 7th, 5. People started noticing. Martha Coelho posted photos on the community page. Blurry shots that showed pale shapes in the water, too structured to be natural, too regular to dismiss. The Coast Guard sent a boat out on the 9th night. They found nothing. No vessels, no divers, no equipment. Water temperature normal, no unusual chemical signatures. The lights appeared again an hour after they left. I didn't sleep much those first 2 weeks. I'd lie in bed and feel the house settle around me, hear the tide working at the rocks below, and I'd know, with the kind of certainty that lives in your bones, that something was coming. Something I'd been waiting 30 years to face. On the 18th night, my son called. David lives in Pennsylvania, works in medical equipment sales, hasn't been home in 3 years. He called at 6 in the morning, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite fear. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to tell me the truth." I waited. "I've been having this dream, 3 nights now. I'm underwater, but I'm not drowning. I'm breathing. And there's a voice, singing, I think, but not in any language I know. And Mom, I feel like I'm supposed to come home, like something's calling me home." I held the phone and said nothing. 30 years of silence, and it was ending like this, with a dream. "Mom? When did it start?" I asked. "Saturday night, October 19th. Why?" The 19th was when the lights changed pattern, when they started moving instead of pulsing in place. "Have you told your sister?" I texted her this morning. "Mom, she's had the same dream. Sarah called 6 hours after David. She's always been more direct than her brother." "What's happening?" she asked. No preamble, no small talk. "You had the dream. Don't do that. Don't confirm it like you knew it was coming. What's happening?" I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold and thought about all the ways I could lie, all the deflections I'd practiced for 3 decades, all the careful stories about why I kept salt in 50-pound bags, why I'd refused to move inland, why I spent so many nights standing on the rocks and staring at water. "I can't explain it over the phone," I said. "Then I'm coming home." She arrived 2 days later. David drove in the day after that. By October 28th, both of my children were sleeping in their childhood bedrooms, and the lights offshore had grown to a constellation, dozens of them now, forming patterns that shifted and reformed, that pulsed in sequence like coded messages. The dreams had intensified, not just David and Sarah anymore. Sarah's teenage daughter was having them now too. Waking up, gasping, talking about warm water and voices, and the overwhelming certainty that something beneath the surface knew her name. "They're getting closer," David said, on the 29th night. We were standing on the beach together, the three of us and my granddaughter Emma, watching the lights move through water so calm it looked like black glass. The dreams. Each night, they feel more real. He wasn't wrong. The lights had moved inshore, still beyond the shelf drop, but closer, maybe 300 yards now instead of a quarter mile. "Grandma?" Emma said quietly. She was 16, sharp-eyed, the kind of kid who noticed everything. "You're not surprised by any of this?" I looked at her, then at my children, grown now, middle-aged, standing on either side of me with their faces turned toward water that held something they couldn't name. "No," I said, "I'm not surprised." Sarah turned to face me fully. "What did you do?" Not what's happening. What did you do? She'd always been able to read me. 30 years ago, I said, I found something. After the hurricane, I kept it. I raised it. And when it got too big to hide, I brought it down here and let it go. David's expression didn't change. He just kept staring at the lights. "Define it," he said finally. Before I could answer, the lights changed. All of them at once, pulsing in rapid sequence, moving in a spiral pattern that drew inward, tighter and tighter, until they concentrated in one location directly offshore from where we stood. Then they went dark. The four of us stood in sudden blackness, breathing in sync, and I felt the same sensation I'd felt 30 years ago when I'd waded into this water with 7 feet of impossible weight in my arms, the certainty of being seen by something the world said couldn't exist. "She's coming back," I said. I didn't tell them anything at first. They arrived within 48 hours of each other. My son drove from Pennsylvania. My daughter flew in from Arizona. Both brought their children. Both looked exhausted in the same way. Dark circles, that specific tension of someone who hasn't slept properly in weeks. We sat at the kitchen table the first night. The lights had appeared again at 9:17, visible through the window. My grandson saw them first. He was 14. He stood and walked to the glass without speaking. My daughter asked what they were. I said I didn't know. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me when she was 16 and knew I was lying about something but couldn't prove it. She was 52 now. The expression hadn't changed. My son said they'd all had the same dream. He described it methodically, the warm water, the voice singing, the sense of being called. His daughter had it. My daughter's son had it. They compared details and found them identical down to the temperature of the water, the specific melody. I said nothing. They asked if I was having the dreams. I told them no. That was true. I didn't need dreams. I'd known she was out there for 31 years. The lights moved in patterns offshore. My son filmed them on his phone. My daughter searched for explanations online, algae blooms, military exercises, fishing vessels. None of the explanations fit. The lights were too organized, too deliberate. On the third night, my daughter asked me directly. She sat across from me after the others had gone to bed. The lights were still visible, pulsing against the dark water. She said, "You know what this is?" I told her I didn't. She said, "You've been watching that shoreline every night since we were children. You kept that industrial tank behind the house until we were in high school. You never explained why. You never dated anyone, never left this property for more than a day at a time. And every single night of my childhood, you walked down to the beach after you thought we were asleep." I had not known she'd noticed that. She said, "Something happened here, something you never told us. And it's happening again. And you're going to explain it, or I'm calling someone who can make you explain it." I looked at her. She was serious. She had her father's stubbornness. I'd raised her to trust evidence and demand truth. So I told her. I told her about the hurricane, about what I found in the boat shed, about the years of salt water and live fish, and the fear that someone would discover us, about watching her grow too large for containment and too intelligent for captivity, about the choice I made in 1999 to carry her down to the water and let her go. My daughter sat very still. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she asked if I had any proof. I showed her the photographs I'd kept hidden for 3 decades. Polaroids mostly, faded but clear enough. A child's face above water, gray eyes, the tail. She studied them for a long time. Then she said, "The lights." I said, "Yes." She said, "She's out there." I said, "I thought so." My daughter called her brother down. I told the story again. He listened the same way his sister had, silent, processing. By dawn, they both believed me. Not because they wanted to. Because the evidence was in front of them, and the alternative explanations had all failed. We agreed to go to the beach together the next night, all of us, to wait for the lights and see what happened when we didn't run from them. I hadn't been back to that specific stretch of shore since 1999. I'd released her there because the shelf dropped to deep water quickly, because it was isolated, because I thought it would be final. 31 years later, I walked the same path with my children and grandchildren behind me, toward lights that pulsed in rhythm with something I'd last heard as a low-frequency call vibrating through rock and bone. She surfaced at 6:43 in the morning. The lights had stopped at midnight. We'd stayed on the beach anyway. My son built a fire. My grandchildren fell asleep in the sand. My daughter and I sat watching the waterline as the sky began to pale. The shape appeared first as a disturbance in the shallows, something large moving with purpose. My daughter stood. I stayed seated. I knew already. She rose from the waves in stages, head first, then shoulders, then torso, powerfully built, muscular in a way that suggested strength against pressure and current. Her arms were human in structure, but scaled along the forearms. Her face was recognizable, the same gray eyes, the same bone structure, but matured, weathered. Gill structures were visible along her neck, opening and closing as she moved between water and air. She stopped in waist-deep water. The tail, dark, streamlined, easily 8 feet long, moved in slow sweeps to keep her upright. She was looking at me. My daughter was speaking, but I didn't hear the words. My son had woken the others. They stood together several yards back. I walked forward until I was knee-deep in the water. She made a sound, not speech. A vocalization that resonated in my chest the same way her calls had resonated through the property decades ago. I recognized it as greeting, as recognition. I said her name, the name I'd given her when she was small enough to hold. I don't know if she understood the word, but she responded to the sound of my voice. She moved closer. There were marks on her, scars along her shoulders and sides, evidence of a life lived in conditions I couldn't imagine. But she moved with ease, with confidence. She was whole. Behind her, deeper in the water, other shapes moved, larger. I counted 3, possibly 4. They stayed submerged, but their presence was deliberate. She had not come alone. She reached into the water and brought up something wrapped in kelp. She held it toward me. I took it. The kelp was fresh, still dripping. Inside was black coral, deep water species, the kind found only at significant depth, and shells I didn't recognize, and a single shark tooth the size of my palm, pierced and strung on a woven cord. The cord was woven, deliberately crafted, proof of hands that could work fiber, proof of intention. She watched me examine it, then she reached out and touched my face. Her hand was webbed, cold, and gentle. She held the touch for 3 seconds. I heard my daughter crying behind me. Then she released me, turned, and sank back into the water in one fluid motion. The shapes in the deeper water moved with her. Within seconds, they were gone. The surface settled. The sun was fully up. I stood in the shallows holding kelp and coral and a shark tooth on a woven cord. My son was next to me. He helped me back to shore. The encounter lasted 8 minutes. She surfaced 30 yards from shore in water deep enough that her tail never touched bottom. The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky had lightened enough to see clearly. Her shoulders were broader than any human woman's. Her arms showed the kind of muscle that comes from constant use against resistance. The gray eyes were the same, exactly the same, but the face had matured, sharpened, become something both familiar and utterly foreign. She didn't speak. She watched the mother for perhaps a full minute without moving. Then she dove. When she surfaced again 20 seconds later, she was 15 yards closer, and she held something wrapped in kelp. She placed it on a rock that jutted above the waterline at high tide, securing it carefully, then backed away into deeper water. Behind her, 3 shapes broke the surface briefly, larger, darker, watching. Then they were gone. She lifted one hand, webbed between the fingers now, the nails thickened into something like claws, and pressed her palm flat against her chest. Then she extended that same hand toward the mother. She held it there for 5 seconds. Then she sank beneath the surface and didn't return. The lights never appeared again. The dream stopped that night. The kelp wrap bundle contained black coral from depths no recreational diver reaches, 6 shells that later consultation identified as abyssal species, and a single shark tooth the size of a hand, pierced and strung on braided fiber. Deliberate work, proof of craft, culture, intention. She's 70 now. Her children are middle-aged. Her grandchildren ask questions about the shark tooth that hangs in the hallway, and they receive an answer that sounds like myth, but is corroborated by 5 people who stood on that beach together and watched something acknowledge them before returning to the deep. The question isn't whether it happened. The physical evidence exists. The question is whether she was ever truly gone, or whether she spent 30 years in the cold water just beyond the continental shelf, waiting for the right moment to surface and confirm what the mother had always needed to know, that the choice was right, that the daughter survived, that love persists even when it requires letting go. The ocean keeps what it's given, but sometimes, rarely, impossibly, it gives something back.